Well, we end today's show with the acclaimed people's poet and professor Martín Espada. Martín has been compared to Pablo Neruda and is widely known as the prime Latino poet of his generation. His latest collection of poetry has just been released. It's called Vivas, To Those Who Have Failed, a title taken from a line by Walt Whitman. Espada begins his collection with a tribute to the 1913 Patterson Silk Strike, when a group of mostly immigrant workers in New Jersey fought for improved working conditions and an 8-hour day.
Espada goes on to address struggles and injustices up to the present day, including the police killings of unarmed African Americans and the spate of U.S. mass shootings. Martín Espada also pays tribute to his late father, the legendary photojournalist, teacher, and activist Frank Espada. Born in Puerto Rico in 1930, he worked for decades documenting the Puerto Rican diaspora as well as the civil rights movement in the United States. Frank Espada died in 2014. Martín Espada joins us now. The acclaimed poet and professor at University of Massachusetts Amherst won the American Book Award and has been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. His new collection of poetry is just out, Vivas, To Those Who Have Failed. It's great to have you with us, Martín.
Thank you.
You know, before we even talk, could you share a poem? Because that is you talking to the world.
Sure. This is indeed a poem about police violence against people of color. Your audience will recognize many of the cases to which I refer. It's called How We Could Have Lived or Died This Way. Epigraph. Not songs of loyalty alone are these, but songs of insurrection also. For I am the sworn poet of every dauntless rebel the world over. Walt Whitman. I see the dark-skinned bodies falling in the street as their ancestors fell before the whip and steel, the last blood pooling, the last breath spitting. I see the immigrant street vendor flashing his wallet to the cops, shot so many times there are bullet holes in the soles of his feet. I see the deaf wood carver and his pocket knife crossing the street in front of a cop who yells, then fires. I see the drug raid, the wrong door kicked in, the minister's heart seizing up. I see the man hawking a fistful of cigarettes, the cop's choke hold that makes his wheezing lungs stop wheezing forever. I am in the crowd, at the window, kneeling beside the body left on the asphalt for hours, covered in a sheet. I see the suicides. The conga player handcuffed for drumming on the subway, hanged in the jail cell with his hands cuffed behind him. The suspect leaking blood from his chest in the back seat of the squad car. The 300-pound boy said to stampede bare-handed into the bullets drilling his forehead. I see the coroner nodding, the words he types in his report burrowing into the skin like more bullets. I see the government investigations stacking, words buzzing on the page, then suffocated as bees suffocate in a jar. I see the next black man fleeing as the fugitive slave once fled the slave catcher, shot in the back for a broken tail light. I see the cop handcuff the corpse. I see the rebels marching, hands upraised before the riot squads, faces in bandanas against the tear gas, and I walk beside them unseen. I see the poets who will write the songs of insurrection generations unborn will read or hear a century from now. Words that make them wonder how we could have lived or died this way, how the descendants of slaves still fled and the descendants of slave catchers still shot them, how we awoke every morning without the blood of the dead sweating from every pore.
That's Martín Espada reading to us How We Could Have Lived or Died This Way. Martín, I want to ask, so much of your poetry is dealing with the politics and the realities, the social conditions of our time. How you first decided that this was part of the mission of your poetry?
I grew up with it. I grew up in an activist household. I grew up in my father's household. Resistance was as natural as breathing. I was surprised when I went into the world and discovered that not everybody was raised the way I was. So when it turned to the writing of poetry, quite naturally, it turned to poetry about social justice. That's how I was raised.
And you mentioned your father. Of course, I knew him for many years. I was inspired by him as well. And you talk about he was arrested in 1949 in Biloxi, Mississippi, for refusing to sit in the back of the bus. I didn't even know that, even though I'd known Frank for many years.
Oh yes, yeah. Oh yes, that happened. And he was always raising hell. That was his advice to everybody.
You wrote a magnificent poem about your dad. Could you share that with us?
Absolutely. This is the poem I read at his memorial service, and it's called El Moriviví. The meaning of that term will become apparent. El Moriviví, in memoriam Frank Espada, 1930 to 2014. The Spanish means, I died, I lived. In Puerto Rico, the leaves of El Moriviví close in the dark and open at first light. The fronds curl at a finger's touch and then unfurl again. My father, a mountain born of mountains, the tallest Puerto Rican in New York, who scraped doorways, who could crack the walls with the rumble of his voice, kept a Moriviví growing in his ribs. He would die, then live. My father spoke in the tongue of El Moriviví, teaching me the parable of Joe Fleming, who screwed his lit cigarette into the arms of the spics he caught flapping like fish. My father was a bony boy, the nerves in his back crushed by the Aiello Coal and Ice Company, the load he lifted up too many flights of stairs. 3 times they would meet to brawl for a crowd after school. The first time, my father opened his eyes to gravel and the shoes of his enemy. The second time, he rose and dug his arm up to the elbow in the monster's belly. So badly did he want to tear out the heart and eat it. The third time, Fleming did not show up, and the boys with cigarette burns clapped the spindly champion on the back all the way down the street. Fleming would become a cop, fired for breaking bones in too many faces. He died smoking in bed, a sheet of flame up to his chin. There was a Moriviví sprouting in my father's chest. He would die, then live. He spat obscenities like sunflower seeds at the driver who told him to sit at the back of the bus in Mississippi, then slipped his cap over his eyes and fell asleep. He spent a week in jail, called it the best week of his life, strode through the jailhouse door and sat behind the driver of the bus on the way out of town, his Air Force uniform all that kept the noose from his neck. He would come to know the jailhouse again among hundreds of demonstrators ferried by police to Hart Island on the East River, where the city of New York stacks the coffins of anonymous and stillborn bodies. Here, Confederate prisoners once wept for the stars and bars. Now, the prisoners sang freedom songs. The jailers outlawed phone calls, so we were sure my father must be a body like the bodies rolling waterlogged in the East River. So he came back from the island of the dead, black hair combed meticulously. When the riots burned in Brooklyn night after night, my father was a peacemaker on the corner with a megaphone. A fiery chunk of concrete fell from the sky and missed his head by inches. My mother would tell me, "Your father is out dodging bullets." He spoke at a rally with Malcolm X, incantatory words billowing through the bundled crowd, lifting hands and faces. "Teach!" they cried. My father clicked a photograph of Malcolm as he bent to hear a question, finger pressed against the chin. 2 months later, the assassins stampeded the crowd to shoot Malcolm, blood leaping from his chest as he fell. My father would die too, but then he would live again. After every riot, every rally, every arrest, every night in jail, the change from his pockets landing hard on the dresser at 4 a.m. every time I swore he was gone for good. My father knew the secrets of El Moriviví, that he would die, then live. He drifted off at the wheel, drove into a guardrail, shook his head, and walked away without a web of scars or fractures. He passed out from the heat in the subway, toppled onto the tracks, and somehow missed the third rail. He tied a white apron across his waist to open a grocery store, pulled a revolver from the counter to startle the gangsters demanding protection, then put up signs for a clearance sale as soon as they backed out the door with their hands in the air. When the family finally took a vacation in the mountains of the Hudson Valley, a hotel with waiters in white jackets and white paint peeling in the room, the roof exploded in flame as if the ghost of Joe Fleming and his cigarette trailed us everywhere. And it was then that my father appeared in the smoke like a general leading the charge in battle, shouting commands at the volunteer fire company, steering the water from the hoses, since he was immune to death by fire or water, as if he wore the crumbled leaves of El Moribibi in an amulet slung around his neck. My brother called to say El Moribibi was gone. My father tore at the wires, the electrodes, the IV, saying that he wanted to go home. The hospital was a jailhouse in Mississippi. The furious pulse that fired his heart in every fight flooded the chambers of his heart. The doctors scrutinized the film, the grainy shadows in the light, but could never see. My father was Amori Bibi. I died, I lived. He died, he lived. He dies, he lives.
That's Frank Espada, El Morivivi. For those who are not familiar with El Morivivi in Puerto Rico, could you explain what it is?
Yeah, in Latin it's the Mimosa pudica. It's a pan-tropical weed. It shrinks from contact, and it also closes in the dark and then opens at light. And so it became the ideal metaphor for me, for the many lives, deaths, and rebirths of Frank Espada, who has died and now he's back.
Spoke at a Malcolm rally. Malcolm X.
He did. He spoke with Malcolm X through the end of 1964. And of course, my father was also a documentary photographer. He founded something called the Puerto Rican Diaspora Documentary Project. And so he photographed Malcolm after the rally.
And he also, he once gave me his most famous photograph is that photograph of Malcolm that you mentioned in the poem. He once gave me a copy of it, which I still have on my wall.
Well, he photographed many activists. He photographed you.
Oh yes, me many times. My sister, all the folks who were in the Lords, but he went across the United States, to Hawaii, to Puerto Rican communities, all that a lot of people didn't know about, yes, to capture the leaders and the struggles of those communities.
Yes, and within the art of photography, but also in every aspect of his life, my father was an activist. We often hear this phrase, the greatest generation, in reference to mostly white males who fought during World War II. Well, for the Puerto Rican community, my father's generation was the greatest generation. Whether we're talking about Frank Espada, Jack Agüero, Severina Antonetti, the activists born in the 30s who raised hell in the 60s. And we should still be following their example, raising hell when we can.
Finally, you knew James Foley as a student, right, who was beheaded by ISIS. Yes. We're going to the Sundance Film Festival. There'll be a documentary about him. His family will be there. How did you know him, Martín?
He was a student of mine at the University of Massachusetts. He got an MFA in fiction there, and I was on his committee. But more importantly, I referred James Foley to a place called the Care Center in Holyoke. It's an alternative education program for adolescent mothers, mostly Puerto Rican, who have dropped out of the school system there. And Jim Foley taught English to Spanish speakers there. That's who Jim was. He was compassionate. He was always trying to do the right thing.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us. Martín Espada, the great award-winning poet and writer, professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, has written numerous books, including The Republic of Poetry, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His new collection is titled Vivas, to Those Who Have Failed.